Okay, just want to take a second to thank Nexmo, who's been a huge supporter of Laracon, Laracon Online. And it's a really cool system for communicating with voice, messaging, video. They provide all the APIs, so you don't have to set any of that stuff up. Just simple API calls, make a phone call, make an SMS, receive a phone call, receive an SMS, all those kind of things. Just really simple and well done over there on Nexmo. And so check it out. Go to nexmo.com. They have a €10 credit in the swag bag, so you can do that and just give it a shot. That gets you actually quite a bit of API calls. So you can give that a shot, play around with it just for fun or in one of your apps and see how it goes. But a big thanks to Nexmo for, again, being a big sponsor of Laracon Online. Okay. Let's get Steve in here. There he is. Get the mute. Yep. He's well lit this year.
There we go.
He's got sound. He's got light. He's got a dog.
Oh, my dog just came down to hang out. Hey, buddy. Just doing a conference call right now. Okay.
All right.
There we go. Can you see my slides now? It's good.
Yeah, I can see it. So you're all set. Take it away.
Okay, great. Okay, so hey everyone. If you don't know who I am, my name is Steve Schoger. Now this comes up a lot. This is how you pronounce my name. It's Schoger. And sorry. So I'm a visual designer from Ontario, Canada. I guess I'm one of the 3 Canadians here on Laracon Online today. I guess we're all from Ontario too. Now, most people know me as the guy who teaches design to developers using tactics instead of talent. And I hope to do just that today. So in this talk, I'm going to be sharing a few tips that will help you improve your own designs. Now, I found the best way to teach this stuff is by example. So my approach today is going to be no different. We're going to be taking a look at an example I created that addresses some of the more common problems that I've observed developers struggling with. And with that, it's going to be filled with a lot of mistakes that I see being made. So if you caught my talk from last year, this one's going to have a similar tone to it, but it's using entirely new concepts. It's a brand new talk. And last year's talk wasn't like a prerequisite or anything, so you don't have to worry about that. So let's get started by taking a look at the example we'll be refactoring today. So this is a design for a fictional flight booking application. And I want to emphasize that this is just an arbitrary example that I made because I felt it covered a lot of the concepts that I wanted to share. I realized that a flight booking application is quite specific. Not everyone is working on a project like this, but there's going to be a ton of practical tips that should be useful for any application. And I took a lot of the ideas from existing booking applications and just sort of gave it my own twist. So let's just break it down one by one here. So at the top, we have a hero with the top bar navigation, a large headline to draw users in and help them understand the value of the service. Right below the headline, we have a few search options to help narrow the results when looking for a flight. So we have some radio buttons to select the type of trip it is. There's a few inputs for selecting the origin and destination cities. And then some checkboxes just to upsell the user into booking a hotel or renting a car. And then finally, we have the search button to submit the results. Then below this section, we have a table that lists the deals of the day. So if you're booking a trip last minute, let's say. So we'll be covering a few tips on table design. And then below that, we have a few vacation package deals. So if you want to travel on a budget, you go to this section. And each of these are presented with a set of data displayed in a card component. And as we get closer to the bottom, there's a newsletter sign-up form, so users can stay informed on hot deals. And then, of course, we have our footer with the sitemap, location options, and some legal jargon. So like I said, there's a lot of commonly used components that could be used in a variety of applications. And our goal today is just to touch on some cosmetic changes without affecting the overall structure. So let's get right into it. Let's move back to the top of this design and see what can be improved in the header section. So I think the most glaring problem is the text on this background image. So photos can be pretty dynamic in that they have a lot of highlights, lowlights, and midtones. But you need to give text a consistent contrast. So using a background image like this is a really easy way to add impact to a hero. But with that, you run the risk of having poor contrast with text when it's overlaid on top, especially on top of busy areas. So in this case, there's some background interference with some of the labels on the left. So the easy is find an image contains space that provides you with an area for text. And this image does a pretty good job at that, but like I said, there's some interference. So it's sometimes easier said than done, especially when you're digging through like a royalty-free library for a perfect photo. So the way to solve this problem is to limit the amount of dynamic areas on the image. So one way to do that is by simply adding a semi-transparent overlay to the background image. So this will sort of bring down the light areas and give the giving the image like less contrast against the dark areas, helping the light text stand out a bit more. But you can also invert this treatment and use a white overlay. So this will tone down the dark areas and kind of reduce the contrast with the light areas. Now you can do this in CSS, but for a little more control, if you have access to a graphical editing tool like Sketch or Figma or Adobe, you can even bring the image in to those tools and adjust the contrast and brightness for similar results. Now, you can even take this a step further and colorize the image with a single color. This is just a great way to add impact to a hero and to pair the image with your existing brand colors. Now, again, this can be achieved in code as well using the CSS blending options, blending modes, but that does have limited browser support. So again, I personally recommend bringing the image into graphical editing software and then create the effect there. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So for example, if you take this into an app like Figma, and Figma, it's free for single users, by the way, and then you got to start paying when you start introducing a team. So everyone should have access to Figma. Now, when you import the image, Figma has this sidebar and has all your options on the right there. So when you import the image and click on it, you'll see the thumbnail there under the fill section. So start by clicking on the thumbnail, and then you'll be presented with a bunch of image editing options. So from there, you can reduce the saturation to 0. So it's a black and white image now. And you can adjust the contrast and a few other things just to level things out a bit. Then you're going to add a fill layer on top. So do this by clicking the plus icon next to the fill area in the sidebar, what I've highlighted there. And then from here, you can choose the color you want. So I'm going to use this dark blue. And then in the color panel, click the drop icon on the top right, and that's your blending mode options. So from there, we're going to change the blending mode to multiply. And what that does is it sort of brings the image behind the fill. It brings it through so you can kind of see some of the details. And I even like to go ahead and, if I have really good contrast, is adjust the opacity on that fill there, just to bring the image details out a bit more. So yeah, and if you do this in Sketch, it has a similar workflow. And if you're working with a darker color like the blue I'm using here, you'll definitely have enough contrast for your text. So now, like I said, Figma is free, so you should have access to it. But another great tool that will give you similar results, it's a web app. Someone told me about this. It's called Duotone by Shape Factory. The link's at the bottom there. And it allows you to take two colors and use them on the highlights and the lowlights of an image. So in the example that we have shown here, it's using like a bright cyan for the highlights and then a purple for the lowlights. And you can even mix it up and choose two completely different colors, sort of to get that Spotify effect. If you use Spotify, a lot of the album covers kind of look like this. So check it out, play around with it. It's a pretty cool app. And so you can upload your own images on here. Or you can, it has Unsplash built right into it, so you can search Unsplash. So if you've never heard of Unsplash, I highly recommend you check it out. It's just a great resource for looking for high quality royalty-free images. Basically, you can search based on the subject and you'll get a ton of great results. So that's where I found the image that we're using today. So it's definitely worth digging through. And yeah, like I said, this is just a great way to add impact to a hero and pair the image with your existing brand colors. And of course, it gives you that nice consistent contrast on the background. So our text is much more legible and pops much more. Now, I chose this dark blue for the site, but I don't want to just graze over that. I thought it'd be helpful if I shared how I choose primary colors for a site. Now, the answer to that is quite simple. I steal them. I spend a lot of time looking on inspiration sites. One site I like to check out frequently is landbook.com. The link's at the bottom there again, land-book.com. Another one is siteinspire.com, just to name a few. Like these are just like website galleries, some of the best websites on the internet. They're usually curated by designers. So there's some great inspiration on there. And then while I'm browsing, if I see a combination of colors I like, I may bookmark it or just sample the colors for future reference. And another great place to go for inspiration, I think most of us are familiar with it, is Dribbble. And if you have a general idea of what colors you want to use already, Dribbble has this color picker tool you can access by clicking that 3 dots menu up on the top. So if you open that up and click the colors links down at the bottom there, it's kind of highlighted. You can search for shots based on a specific color you have in mind. So if you click the drop, the hex code and the drop at the top, that opens up this palette. And like having a limited palette like this, it should make it a bit easier to make a decision. You can even adjust the threshold to if you want only like a certain amount of that color showing up in the shots. So you can play around with it there. And then from there, you get a ton of great results using colors handpicked by professional designers. And then once you find an example you like, you can sample the colors found on the bottom right of the Dribbble shot. So I found this shot that has kind of this blue and yellow thing going on. I kind of liked the way that looked. So, and to be perfectly honest, once I do find something I like this, I like the blue and yellow, I end up using the Tailwind default colors. So in this case, if I'm using something like the blue and yellow in that Dribbble shot, I might use the blue and yellow palette from Tailwind. Now, I'm biased because I pick most of the colors on Tailwind, but it usually has what I'm looking for or something that's close enough to what I'm looking for. And very rarely, but every now and then I might create a new palette to add to the Tailwind's config file. But usually I can work with the defaults and have something close to what I'm looking for. So that should really limit your choices. So yeah, now that we've added the blue, we'll be introducing the yellow from that shot shortly. But let's take a look at this navbar at the top. So the first thing I want to say is that navbars don't need to be in a bar. I see every time developers build a site, they assume that the top navbar needs to be a bar. But putting in the navigation elements directly on the background, it makes things feel a little bit more open and more comfortable. Really create some space up there. Now, I gave this a subtle boundary. You can just add like a light border like I did. So I use like a single white pixel border just with reduced opacity. And then this sort of kind of connects everything at the top. So it draws our eyes over to the stuff on the right and it kind of associates it better with the stuff on the left. So yeah. So this is looking cleaner. And now that I've adjusted the background, this headline's looking much better, but I want to create a little more contrast between the headline and the subtitle. So the simplest and most common way to create contrast is by using size. So either making the subtitle a bit smaller or making the headline much bigger. But that's not really the way I like to approach it. Another way to do this is by using a soft color. So to make white text softer on a dark background, your first instinct might be to darken the text by decreasing the lightness. So it's a light gray. So that's what it looks like with a lighter gray. It's a very subtle change, but it does do the trick of de-emphasizing it a bit, but it always looks a bit off on a colored background. So don't use gray text on colored backgrounds. So you need to consider that what we're trying to achieve is reduce contrast in that you want to make the text color closer to the background, not gray. Now, you might think the best way to do this is reduce the opacity. And yeah, this does reduce the contrast again, but it often results in the text looking a little dull and washed out. So there it is gray. There it is with white text with a lower opacity. It almost looks gray. So a better approach that I like to take is to handpick a new color based on the background color. So if you're using something like the Tailwind colors, it already considers this. You can just pick a lighter color. But if you're choosing your own colors, I typically just start by sampling the background color. And then I adjust the saturation and lightness until it looks right. So if you're familiar with the color picker that we're looking at here, this is an HSB picker. It's what you get on like most graphical editing tools and most browser dev tools. And so what I would do is just drag the picker to the top left for a lighter color. And the end result might look something like this. So here it is with lower opacity, and here it is with the hand-picked blue. So it's a subtle difference, but it looks much better. Now, you can even take this a step further by rotating the hue and using the perceived brightness to your advantage. So let me explain that. What does that mean? Well, every hue has an inherent perceived brightness. So in this diagram, I have the hue shown on the left, and on the right, it has the values showing how they're actually perceived to our eyes. So when we're working with colors like yellow and blue, even when you give each hue the same lightness value, yellow still looks brighter. So this is called luminance. And by taking samples from all of the hues with 100% saturation and 50% lightness, and then plot them on a chart like this, you'll start to see what colors have the highest and lowest perceived brightness. So you can see here that the yellow is the brightest, up in the top left corner there, and blue is the darkest, more towards the right at the bottom. So one thing that's notable is that this is not a linear pattern. So how does all of this help us? Well, I'm going to show you here. The cool part about all of this is that normally when you want to change how light a color looks, you adjust the lightness and saturation value seen at the top here. And obviously, as you can see, it works to lighten the color or darken it if you're working in reverse, but you often lose some of that color intensity. So since different hues have different perceived brightness, you can also change the brightness of a color by rotating the hue to the nearest bright color. So in our case, because our background is blue, we're going to rotate the hue to the nearest bright color. So in this case, cyan. So as you can see in this example, it's a pretty nifty trick to create some sexy gradients, as you see at the bottom there. Now, I wouldn't rotate it more than like 30 degrees. That's usually enough to get a vibrant gradient like that. So it works on gradients, but this trick also works great with light text on a colored background. So if we go back to our design, looking at the secondary title, we have our color based on the background color and the adjusted lightness. But once you rotate the hue, it looks like this. So this is just a great way to make text, just bring up that contrast ratio and still keeping the colorfulness of it. Okay, so let's just starting to get interesting. So let's move on to the search options. So as much as the dark background helps to distinguish the individual inputs and labels, it's still a bit tricky to read because the text is pretty small. So instead of letting these components float on the background, we're going to contain them in a panel. Now, when you add a panel like this, you're going to need to introduce a bit of space to give these components some room to breathe. So lack of white space is probably one of the biggest mistakes I see developers make when designing for the web. So I want to share a bit of a framework to help solve this problem. So the common approach to introducing space is to just add a bit at a time. And if it still feels a bit tight, you continue adding a bit more, right? The problem with this approach is that you're only adding the minimum amount of space until your site no longer looks bad. So as you introduce more space, it's going to look better than your cramped starting point, of course. But this may cause you to stop almost too early when you're trying to find the right amount of space, leaving you feeling a little bit uncertain. So a better approach is to start with too much white space. So like an excessive amount, and just gradually remove it until you're happy with the result. Now, at first, when focused on an individual element, you might think it feels like too much white space, but in the context of the rest of the UI and it ends up looking like just the right amount. So yeah. So the next thing we're going to take a look at are these inputs. So first, always remember to use input length as an affordance. You want to create an expectation of how long an entry should be when typing in an input. So in all of these cases, you can probably fit the, like all of these cases, you can probably fit the input into a field that's about half the size, which we have here. So in this case, it will allow us to comfortably fit all the fields on a single line when on full desktop view. Now, major elements like this, like the container, they're not the only things on the page that need room to breathe. This also applies to components like inputs. So I'm going to increase the height of the inputs. I like to be pretty generous with space on inputs. I pretty much always use at least a total height of like 40 pixels with like that, like that's with the text and the padding around it. But in this case, I'm using these inputs are 48 pixels high. So I'd like to give them quite a bit of room to breathe. Now, at the moment, these inputs have just a simple border with the inner white space. And unfortunately, this isn't that distinct when on a white background. So a nice way to add distinction is to add a subtle off-white background to the input. Just enough to create that distinction, but like not too much where it looks disabled. So if I'm using like tailwind grays, for example, this is where I would use like the lightest gray on that palette. And just to give the inputs that just a little more visual interest, we want to give it a little bit more scannability. We're going to add some icons to them. Now, we're not going to replace the labels with icons. I see that happen quite a bit. But these icons really aren't that obvious. And it's just generally bad for accessibility to remove labels. Now, in adding icons to support text, it might make sense to give them the same color as the text. So here we have black text, so you might think to give the icon, make the icon black. The problem with this is that icons end up looking too dark, even though they share the same color. So why is that? Well, let me explain. You want to create weight. You want to create a balance with weight and contrast. So icons tend to cover a lot more of the surface area, especially when working with solid icons like this. This makes them feel unbalanced when placed next to text that utilizes a lot less space of the total surface area. So the way to work around this is to reduce the contrast by giving the icons a softer color. This sort of works like a counterbalance. So even though we haven't adjusted the overall size of the icons, they feel much more balanced next to the text and they're not overly intrusive. Okay, now that we've given these input fields a nice treatment, what about these radio buttons and checkboxes? Well, right now they're looking a bit boring and they're just using the browser defaults. So a sure way to make an app look more polished is to remove any of the browser defaults with something a little more custom. And this is just a great opportunity to add some color that we've already added and take something from feeling a bit more, that was feeling boring to feeling a bit more well-designed. And this goes the same for inputs. You can change the drop-down arrow to something that's more consistent with the icons that we're using already. So right now, in that depart return field, in the travelers field, we have those, just those standard like bootstrap, like defaults, drop-down arrows. So we're going to take those from a set as well. And in that change, I also reduced the label size to 14 pixels, just so it's not taking away from the input value itself. I always like to make my labels a bit smaller than the text within the input. Okay, let's also better utilize the horizontal space by moving the search button just to the far right. So it's aligned with these checkboxes on the left. And this will reduce the overall vertical space that it's taking up. And this also lines up nicely, so it's below the last input users are likely to interact with. So they're not jumping from one side to the other. Okay. So let's also increase the height of the button so it's consistent with those inputs. And plus, we can add an icon to the button. And just to provide a little more clarity, we can be more be more specific with the language. So we're going to change it to search flights. Okay. So that's looking much cleaner. Let's now introduce, from that dribble shot, there was also yellow in that dribble shot, and I wanted to introduce that into the design. So let's introduce that yellow that we discussed earlier into that button. Now, it's always difficult to achieve high contrast ratios with white on bright colors like yellow. This happens a lot with green as well. It's kind of a fuzzy area with green. And if you want a high contrast ratio with yellow, you end up closer with something closer to bronze. And that's not really any good. So the creative way to work around this is to invert the colors. So instead of using white text on a dark background, you need to use dark text on a bright background. Now, we already learned that with the subtitle that we don't want to use black or white text on a colored background, as it just looks a bit off. So once again, we're going to saturate this with a bit of the background color. Now, because yellow is a brighter color, we need to do the opposite of what we did with the subtitle, which was a light color on a dark background. So what we need to do is make the dark text more saturated with a darker color. So something that's going to be a bit closer to brown. And just to better, so that's what we see here. Here's black and here's brown. And just to better associate the upsell checkboxes and the button as they are both the last step in the workflow, let's give them a bit of distinction from the rest of the panel. So the simple solution to this would be to divide this with a border, but that can be a bit busy. So we're gonna make it with an off-white background. And it's just a nice subtle way to create distinction between two elements. That's not the same as a border. Okay, now having the panel in the hero like this does a great job standing out because it's not very interesting. So an easy way to make this pop more is to give it some depth. Now, there are a few ways of doing this. One way is to overlap it with other elements on the page. In this case, instead of containing the card entirely within the hero section, you can offset it. So it sits between the two background sections using a negative margin. So that looks sort of cool, but because parts of the panel share the same color as the background at the bottom, it looks a bit funny. So we need to add some distinction. So since we're trying to give this design some depth, let's add a heavy box shadow just to convey some elevation. So this just gives it some nice depth, and it kind of creates a nice border without actually adding a border. It's a nice subtle treatment for that. So I want to explain my process for creating shadows a bit more in depth here. So the first thing worth noting is that I often use multiple shadows within a design to position elements differently on the virtual Z index. So now, the larger the shadow you use, the closer it's going to feel to the user. So here I have a few shadows, and we're going to be introducing these shadows into Tailwind as defaults later this month. So Tailwind version 1. And usually it goes like this. I'll have a small shadow for elements that are closer to the background of the page. This is typically for like buttons or inputs. And then I'll have one that's a little further off the page. So usually for elements like the drop-down menus or maybe small panels. And then sometimes I'll have an additional one for larger panels. So I'm actually going to use this panel, this shadow for the panel we're currently discussing because I really want it to pop. And then finally, I'll have another large one for modals, let's say. So I might go between one of the shadows on the far right here. So here it is again in context. So as you can see, that middle shadow, it looks quite heavy in context. But there's a bit more to this than just an offset box shadow with a heavy blur. You need to consider that some shadows have two parts. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at shadows in the real world, they're typically created by more than one light source that gets disrupted by an object. Now, one is usually an ambient light, and then the other is a direct light. So the shadow created by the ambient light, it's a bit tighter. You can kind of see it at the bottom there. It's a bit tighter and darker with a smaller offset and a smaller blur radius. And then the shadow created by a direct light, it's usually much larger but softer with significantly more of a vertical offset and blur. And then as an element gets further away from a surface, the smaller the dark shadow, smaller dark shadow created by the lack of ambient light slowly disappears. So consider this by using a more subtle shadow as it gets closer to convey that elevation. Furthermore, as the object gets further, it slowly covers that direct light source. So consider this by introducing a negative spread value. So this is all the stuff we consider recently with the tailwind shadows. Okay, and this technique gives you much more creative control than you get with just using a single offset shadow. Okay, so back to the design. Now that we've offset this background below and give it a nice shadow, we're going to do one more thing, and that is to use color to convey depth. So when designing on screens, typically lighter elements feel closer to us than a darker element. So if you want to make something feel even more raised off the background, we can make it a subtle off-white to create that additional contrast. So here it is with a white background at the bottom, and then here it is with just a subtle off-white. Okay, let's move it down to the table below. So now that we've made the background off-white, it's sort of pushed the table back. This is sort of further emphasizing the point about color and depth. So to bring it forward more, we're going to contain it in a panel. Now, we don't want this to have the same amount of depth as the search panel that we just did above. We want this to stand back a bit further away from the user. So to do that, we're going to give it a smaller shadow. So if we refer back to all these shadows I was showing you, we're going to use this second shadow shown here, second from the left. Now, styling tables can be tricky. It's often a lot of data to present in a condensed space. So fortunately, there are a few tricks to make content a little more digestible. So the first thing we're going to do is use alignment. So for most content, it makes sense to left align columns. But for content like dollar values and sometimes dates, it's always wise to right align them. So in this case, everything's left aligned there, but the dollar values on the far right, those I right aligned. And this just makes it so the decimal places are in columns, and this makes it much more easier to compare the magnitudes. Now, another cool CSS trick you can apply to numbers like this is to apply the tabular numbers. So this can be achieved by setting the font feature settings to tnum as seen here. And this basically makes the text act like a monospace font without actually using a monospace font. So it's much cleaner. Okay, so what else can we do to this table? These borders. So these borders are making the table look quite busy. So whenever possible, try to use fewer borders. Borders can make a design look really cluttered, and a nice, more subtle way to distinguish rows on a table is by using zebra striping. So I think that's much cleaner. Now let's look at these headings as well. There's this preconceived notion that titles and headings, they need to be big and bold and stand out against the rest of the page text. But in many cases, headings like this are acting more like labels. They're supporting the content, and they shouldn't be stealing all the attention. So that means that headings like this should be a bit more subtle. So a great treatment that I like to use that I just applied is to use that small, bold, uppercase text with a softer color. Here, the small, softer treatment helps them stand back against the table content, but that bolder uppercase helps them maintain their heading status. So yeah. So this is looking much cleaner already. But let's explore a few more ideas to organize this information. So if columns don't need to be sortable, try consolidating them. Try consolidating the secondary information just for a cleaner look, and that really opens things up a little bit. So if you're working with a more narrow screen, you can tighten it up a bit. And then consider de-emphasizing them by using a smaller and lighter text. Now, if the data calls for it, try enhancing it with using images. So so there I added the airline logos. And let's look at these book now buttons. They're sort of making the entire table look pretty heavy on the right side. Just because they're dark and on a single column, they really draw you away from many other important elements on that page. So we want to give them more of a secondary treatment. So a popular approach to styling buttons is secondary buttons is to simply outline them. And although this does give them that secondary appearance, it can be a bit boring. It tends to be overused. So what I like to do, which is a great alternative, is to give the buttons a soft, solid background based on the text color. So here I'm just using like a subtle gray and making that text dark. And this treatment is just not as heavy, so it looks a little bit more subtle. Okay, let's make this text link as well. Let's make this the same color as the brand color we're using everywhere else, so that dark blue. And just to give it a bit more of that link style, instead of using like an underline to make something look like a link, I like to add like a generic icon, like a chevron to the right of it, just to make it look more like a clickable target. Okay, so I think this table's in a pretty good spot. So let's move on to the vacation package deals at the bottom here, displayed in cards. So often when working with images, you may run into the issue of having different aspect ratios to work with. So this can really throw off the layout if you have multiple images displayed side by side, as seen here. So instead of just using the aspect ratio, center the image inside a fixed container and crop out anything that doesn't fit. Now, the beauty of this is that you don't need to edit the image inside of like a graphical editing tool before bringing it into the web. It's quite easy to do this in CSS by making the image you're using a background image and then setting the CSS background size property to cover. And this just cleans up the entire layout quite nicely and making things look much more organized. Now, the buttons at the bottom here, those book now buttons, we don't necessarily need these buttons because like sites like Airbnb, this is kind of like a card-based layout, and YouTube, they're both great examples of how these card-based layouts can get away without including buttons, and they still manage to look clickable. So we can remove them to our design. Okay, now the details of these cards, they look a bit busy at the moment, so let's see what we can do to clean them up a bit. So let's zoom in a little bit here. So the first thing I want to address is the labels. And in many cases, you don't actually need a label. So for example, in this case, we have the $12.95 there. It's clearly a dollar value. It's clearly a price, so you don't need the label for that. And the link, the URL there, it's clearly linked with the .com. So it's clearly a website. So you don't need a label to identify that. Now, when you're able to present data without labels, it gives you much more creative control to emphasize important information. Like in this case, the price is probably way more important to the user than the website that they're getting a deal from. So we want to make that a bit bigger and bolder, and then soften that website a little bit. And then we're also going to reduce the noise created with these borders by using a more subtle off-white background to distinguish the sections. So here it is with borders, and there I added just a subtle off-white to distinguish it from the top. And again, try to get creative with the data hierarchy by using a combination of font size, weight, color, and uppercase letters. Just play with it and see what you can come up with. So here I made the location. I use that small uppercase treatment that I like using everywhere. And I just emphasized that description a little bit so it's a bit more readable. Furthermore, we can also use color to enrich data to make it easier to interpret. So for example, if we take these offerings and put them inside of colored badges, so just so they can be taken in at a quick glance, and much like the button at the top, we're going to give these badges, sorry, there's also another one on the right here, that green one. We have a red and green one. We're going to give them that soft, solid background with the dark text, just to make them a bit more subtle and more accessible, because red and green, they're typically hard to get those high contrast ratios. There's kind of a fuzzy area with red and green. So I find that this effect works quite nicely for that. Let's take a look at the newsletter section. So right now, it's just sitting directly on the background. There's nothing really distinguishing it. So it's not very compelling. So one way to add excitement to the background is by simply changing the color. This is a great way to add distinction between entire page sections, and just keep things looking interesting. And this is actually a great technique to use on marketing pages. I see this happening quite a bit, just to split up the different feature sections, just rotating the color. So the idea is to switch up the background using existing colors from the site. So here I used the blue that we're using elsewhere, and then at the bottom I just inverted it. I used our dark, which we're normally using on text, and then inverted the text so it's white on that. And now you can even go as far as adding a background pattern to some of these sections. So in case you've never heard of it, I made this site a while ago. It's called Hero Patterns, which is a collection of repeatable SVG background patterns. It's great for backgrounds on marketing pages or apps like the one we're working on. The topography one is really popular, the one on the right there. And I haven't updated this in a while, actually, but I think there's about 100 patterns on there. I should really make more, but yeah. Okay, let's make a few changes, these elements, just so they're consistent with some of the other changes we've made. So here I gave the newsletter description text the same color treatment as the subtitle at the top. So I gave it that cyan color. I also reintroduced that yellow button, as it just has great contrast on that blue background. And then finally, I increased the size of the input to be the same as everywhere else. Yeah, so this section, it's a little heavy. It's taking up a little bit more vertical space than it needs to. So if you're working on a design that takes up a lot of vertical space like this, and have a lot of horizontal space you can utilize, try to split it up into columns, making the content flow from left to right instead of top to bottom. It works great, especially in a case like this where the solid background color still manages to associate the information with each other. Okay, let's move on to the footer. Now I love big footers like this. They sort of act like a catch-all if you have some nav items you need to include, but they aren't important enough to occupy valuable real estate in the top nav. But with that, it's nice to have some sort of structure when you have a large sitemap like this. So the way I like to handle this is by adding subtle labels to each section. So again, using that same uppercase treatment, that soft uppercase treatment, for the same reasons I've been using it everywhere. It just really helps that content stand out and makes the title stand back, but it still allows them to act like a label. Okay, finally, the last thing that stands out is the legal jargon and the social media icons at the bottom. Right now, they're sort of floating there. Now, I know I mentioned to use fewer borders. I always preach that, but in some cases, they do work great to associate content. So they just sort of solve the problem of the floating elements, and they kind of associate the elements a bit better. So I added just a subtle border above them. Okay, so that nearly wraps everything up, but I just want to make a few more finishing touches just to bring this design to the next level. So first, grays don't have to be gray. Pure grays, they can make a UI look pretty dull and unnatural. So what I like to do is saturate the grays with a bit of blue or brown for a cooler or warmer feel. And the thinking here is that you're sort of adjusting the overall temperature of the site. This is similar to what you experience in the real world from a combination of things like the light source. Say you're using a warm light or a white light, and you may also get this effect from just reflective surfaces. So it just makes everything feel more natural when you saturate the grays. So if you want to make your design feel more cool, saturate your grays with a bit of blue. And if you want them to be more warm, try saturating them with a bit of yellow or brown. Now, I find that I mostly saturate my grays with blue because I usually work with cool primary colors. But I might use warmer grays if I'm working with warmer colors like red, sometimes purple. Sometimes it can work with blue. I know Basecamp consciously did this, and their site's primary color is blue. But try to experiment with both, but I usually work with blue. The Tailwind default colors, grays, they are saturated with a bit of blue. Now, when doing this, if you're working with HSL values, don't forget to increase the saturation for the lighter and darker shades to maintain a consistent temperature. If you don't, those shades will look a bit washed out compared to the grays that are closer to 50%. So, and how much you want to saturate your grays is completely up to you. Add just a little if you want to tip the temperature slightly, or you can crank it up if you really want a really saturated interface. And I know it's hard to see in a chart like that. So here's what it looks like when the grays, when you don't increase the saturation as you get lighter or darker. So that middle one is much more saturated than the ones on the outer parts. And this is what it looks like when you make that adjustment. So this is much more saturated. So still might be hard to tell depending on the screen you're looking at. So here they are stacked again. So it's especially noticeable on the outer ones, the two that are like second from the outside compared to the ones at the top. The ones at the top are much more dull. Okay. Now, like I said, I usually like to go for a more saturated look, especially if I'm working with cool primary colors like the blue I've been using. So here's what it looks like when it's gray, and there it is with the blue. So it makes a big difference. Okay, finally, I just want to share a few insights on choosing fonts. So I'll use good fonts. So at the moment, this design is using the default system font stack. So in this case, San Francisco, because I'm on Mac. On an Android device, you might get Roboto. And these are all great fonts, but to be perfectly honest, I do quite like San Francisco, especially I like using the system font stack for like in-app experiences of a product, and using something more unique for like the marketing page, the branding. But I think it's worth exploring a few different options, and I thought it would be cool to share how I discover new fonts. So there's a lot of ways to learn about new fonts. They're pretty much everywhere. You can simply just search for popular fonts on Google or Adobe fonts. And these are all great services, but that's not very fun. So I get much more interesting and better results by digging a bit further. So this involves a combination of getting inspiration from existing websites. In the same way I find color combinations, sometimes I go to the Font Foundry websites. These are the companies that design the fonts, and I see what fonts they have available. So like Heffler Fonts, they got a great domain name, typography.com. Commercial Type is one of my favorites, and Klim Type Foundry, just to name a few. These are some of my favorite foundries. But I want to share how I use a combination of these methods for choosing fonts and how I landed with the font that I ended up using for this example. So just like choosing color, I go to all the same spots for inspiration. So I check out landbook.com or Site Inspire to see what fonts they're being used. But one time when I was casually browsing the web looking for inspiration, I found myself looking at some of the official themes on Bootstrap. And I came across this one theme that was quite nice, and I was curious about the font being used. And so naturally, I opened up the dev tools to see what font was there, and it was a font called Cerebri Sans. So from there, I Googled the font to see where I can get it and see if there's additional information about it. And then from there, I learned that the font was designed by a guy named Alfredo Marco Pradell. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He runs a studio called Henkin Design, where he and a team have designed a ton of custom high-quality fonts. So I picked up the bundle. It was like $120 for like 45 fonts. It was kind of a no-brainer. It was on sale. And I discovered a font called Barter Exchange, and I thought it would be perfect for this project. So let's take a look. So here it is with San Francisco. And here it is with Barter Exchange. So, and I've been doing this for, and a combination of these things for quite a long time. And so I've built up a decent collection of fonts that I've been going back to regularly. And I've discovered a ton of fonts using this approach. So yeah, so that pretty much wraps everything up. So let's just compare the before and after. So here's what we started with. And here's where we landed. So it's much cleaner. Okay. Now, if you enjoyed this talk and found it useful, I recently launched a book called Refactoring UI with a guy named Adam Wathen. Maybe you know him. I think he's speaking right after me, actually. And it's going to be loaded with it's loaded with a ton of practical tips, just like the ones I shared today. And at the moment, you can get it for 40% off. So check it out. I'm also quite active on Twitter. You can find me at Steve Schoger, where I share a ton of tips like the ones I just shared. So thanks.
All right. Nice job.
Thanks.
Just like magic.
Yeah. Yeah, redesign your site in 45 minutes, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, trust me, everybody watching this has been like, well, I spent 3 days trying to like do 1/3 of that. And
Yeah, well, to be fair, I spent like weeks on this prepping the talk. So I spent probably just as much time as everyone else on this.
That's awesome. I think the one question that came up that a person had was like in the buttons in your design, like I think like the like selecting your airfare buttons and things like that. Like, what do you like on hover states? Like, do you just do the cursor change? Do you change the colors? I'm sure you might do different things, but in that design, what would you think you do there?
Yeah, I typically make it a bit lighter. So I've been referencing Tailwind colors a lot in this because I usually use that. So if whatever color I'm using for the button, I'll just use the one up on the Tailwind scale for that. So I'll use the lighter version of that. Sometimes I go a bit darker, but usually I go a bit lighter.
All right, great. Awesome, man. That's
perfect. Is that it? Okay, I thought there'd be more questions. I actually mocked up a mobile version of the site if you want to take a look at it. But
yeah, show us.
Yeah. I went a little over time, and I thought I'd be going way over time if I did the mobile stuff, because I know tables design comes up a lot. So here's my sketch file. And so table design comes up a lot on and how to make it work on mobile devices. And there's a few solutions to that. One is to obviously just do the horizontal scrolling. That's kind of the hacky way out. And the way I would do it, like, you got to understand, like, table design doesn't, when you reduce it, I would like sometimes like just reduce it down to sort of the main items, like kind of pick out like what are the main things that need to be on the table, and then limit it down to those two options. And then for this example, I kind of made it like an expanded menu, but you can kind of click through. And but for the most part, this design was pretty stackable. So I just like to design pretty heavily in columns, so everything stacks really nicely when you get it down to a mobile device.
Yeah, I like that table idea.
Yeah.
Every developer hates building what you're showing.
Everyone, I know. I was like thinking that too. I mean, you don't have to make this expand. You can like kind of click through to another page. Another option is to, I mean, every developer thinks they have to have a mobile version of their site, but half their stuff I see them send me, it's like, it's designed for developers anyway, and I feel like most of them are going to be on a desktop anyway. So, you know, why do you need to make that mobile version? So
that's true too. I do think there's just like this, you automatically like, well, you got to have mobile, but I think in a lot of cases you might not, when you really think about your audience, or if you can just get away with the pinch to zoom, you know, if that's going to be enough. I mean, there's times I wish sites had pinch to zoom and just gave me the full site and didn't have a mobile version.
Yeah, so, sometimes I love the pinch to zoom.
You know, depending on exactly what you're trying to do. So
exactly. So yeah,
that was great. Thanks a lot,
man. Okay, take care.
Yep.